House. Today, we stand in firm support of the motion. This House will mandate all citizens to vote in national elections. Before I build our case, let me make clear what we mean. Mandatory voting means that every eligible citizen is legally required to cast a vote in national election. It does not mean forcing anyone to choose a candidate they don't believe in. The secret ballot remains sacred. Citizens can still leave their ballot blank, spoil it, or select none of the above if they truly object to every option. The penalty for not voting would be a small, non-criminal fine similar to a parking ticket with fare exemption for those who are ill, traveling, or face genuine hardship. By national elections, we mean the general election that decide a country's central government. The policy is not about local polls or referendums. This is about the one election that shapes the laws and future of an entire nation. Now let's look at the world we live in today. Turnout influencer systems is in crisis. In many established democracies, only half or sometimes barely a third of young people show up to vote. Election after election, the voice of poor, the less educated, and the marginalized are systematically missing. Why? Because voting is too often a luxury for those with money, resources, and a feeling that the system already listens to them. Meanwhile, countries like Australia and Belgium have run mandatory voting successfully for nearly a century, enjoying turnout above 90%. This isn't a wild experiment. It's a proven democratic upgrade. So what is our goal? Simple. To build a stronger, fairer democracy where every voice matters. A democracy where the government really represents all its people, not just the most passionate, the wealthiest, or the angriest. We want to make sure that every citizen's concerns carry equal weight and that the people in power cannot afford to ignore anyone. I will now lay out the three main arguments, keeping them as clear and direct as possible. It makes government represents everyone, not just the loudest voters. Right now, politicians have a mathematical incentive to ignore people who don't vote. If you know that low-income neighborhood have 40% turnout while wealthy suburbs have 80%, will you spend your time and campaign promises on the 18% naturally? This creates a vicious cycle where the ignorance will feel even more disconnected and stay home. Mandatory voting breaks that cycle instantly. When everyone must vote, the entire population becomes the politician's boss. Yes, please.
Alright. You say people can just spoil their ballot, but if they do that, how does mandatory voting actually improve representation? Politicians can still ignore a spoiled vote because as easily as a non-voter. Please.
Because a spoiled ballot is still a signal. It says, I care enough to show up, but I'm unhappy with the options. Silence gives politicians permission to forget you exist. A spoiled vote is a recorded protest that they have to see in the final count, and that puts pressure on them to win you over next time. I will continue my argument. Every policy, healthcare, education, housing has to be designed to appeal the broadest possible cross-section of society. This isn't just theory. After Australia introduced compulsory voting, policies like old age pension expanded quickly because suddenly the working class had a guaranteed voice. A government elected by all is a government that must work for all. It creates a smarter, more just society. Some say we shouldn't force the unwilling to vote because they are ignored. We say mandatory voting is the cure for that ignorance, not the disease. If you know you have to cast a ballot, even a blank one, you have a powerful reason to spend just a little time paying attention. It's like wearing seatbelt, like the act itself becomes a normal civic habit. In compulsory voting nations, citizens are political geniuses, but they casually discuss current events more because politics isn't a distance packager sport. It's a shared responsibility. School and communities also stand up to provide clear, accessible voter information because they know everyone will need it. The result, a society where political knowledge is spread more equally, not locked inside a small elite. We don't need every voter to be a policy expert. We just need a political culture where basic awareness is a universal expectation, not an optional thing. Thank you.
afternoon. I want to say that I appreciate the patience from the paper system team. They want a fairer democracy, and that is a good goal. But I have to tell you that their solution is wrong, and I will explain why. First, they say law of order turnout is unfair, but forcing people to vote doesn't fix that. I agree that lower voter turnout is a problem, but the answer isn't to force people to go to the polls. The purpose isn't just voting like a car, like taking out the drugs, but voting is a right, not a duty. When you force someone to do something they don't suddenly start caring about it. The proposition says forcing people to vote makes society smarter, but honestly, when has forcing someone ever made them excited? People who don't want to vote will just throw out, pick a random name, or leave the ballot blank. That doesn't create care, it creates anger. So, here's my argument. Assertion, force voting, force uninformed people to make decisions they aren't ready to make. The proposition says forced voting will create a smarter, more caring society, but I want to challenge that. The third is, forcing people to vote doesn't make them more informed. It just forces them to join in something they don't understand. Think about it. Imagine you had to take a test on a subject you know nothing about. You're not going to suddenly study and become an expert. You're going to guess or pick answer randomly. The same thing happens with voting. If you don't love politics or you don't understand the issues and you're forced to vote, you're going to pick a name you recognize or vote randomly. That doesn't improve democracy. It hurts. In fact, it can make democracy worse because you're adding random, uninformed choice into the mix. Studies have shown that in countries with forced voting, political knowledge doesn't actually go up. People still don't know the issues, like they just show up. In Australia, for example, research has found that many voters are only a little bit informed about politics. They vote because they have to, not because they care. Meanwhile, in countries like Germany, where voting is voluntary, voters tend to be more involved and more informed. Why? Because they choose to join in. They care. They've made an effort to learn. If you force someone to do something, they often reason it. And if you leave them free to choose, they take ownership of their choice. So forced voting doesn't create a smarter society. It creates a society or resentful, uninformed participants. And now let's bring back to the motion. The proposition wants to force voting because they think it will make citizens smarter and more involved. But we've shown that the opposite is true. Forcing uninformed people to vote doesn't affect. Yes.
Point of information, you say force uninformed people to vote, but don't we force children to go to school so they can learn? Isn't voting the same? We force people to learn so they can make better choice.
So let me tell you, school is about learning. We send kids to school so they can get knowledge. But voting is not learning, it is making a choice. So you cannot force someone to take or to make a smart choice. They have to want to learn and want to care. Also, just because you force someone to do something doesn't mean they will actually learn. Many kids hate school and don't pay attention. The same thing happens with voting. If you force people to vote, they will just show up and pick a random name. So, forcing uninformed people to vote doesn't educate them. It just adds random noise to the election process. And a random noise doesn't strengthen the democracy. It weakens it. Thank you.
adjudicators, with alternate to our worthy opponents and members of the House. My partner played the foundation mandatory voting bills represent government, civic engagement, and less pluralism. I will defend the foundation against the opposition objects. Forced voting violates freedom. This confuse freedom of choice with freedom from responsibility. Democracy already imposed civic duty, taxes, jury duty without anyone calling them tyranny. Voting is the same. You're only asked to show up, never to choose anyone. The secret ballot protects your confidence. This is the basic contract of democracy. Uninformed voters will make bad decisions. Unallocated assumptions, low turnout doesn't produce better decision. It produces decision skewed toward the powerful, knowing they must. What forces citizens to get informed and institutions stand up to help? The effects ignorance by including people, not excluding them. Compulsory voting once solved the deeper political problem. We never claim it without vote. Default on one specific problem, the unequal distribution of political votes, and give us the foundation for everything else. Yes, please.
If voting is a civic contest, why don't we also mandate citizens to attend town halls or read policy papers? Where does forced participation end?
Okay. Because voting is the single moment where a citizen's voice is normally consent, we mandate the minimum necessary act, not the political line. Okay. On first voting follows freedom of choice. The negative points to Australians who still refuse to vote despite France and to Canada and the UK functioning without any mandate. But a system that has collapsed isn't the same as a system that works well. Voluntary system is still produces the participatory gap with zones where the poor and the young seriously underrepresented. And in Australia, anyone who doesn't want to choose candidate can submit a blank or spoiled ballot. But freedom of conscience stays fully intact. We only require showing up, never a choice. Unforcing voting forces and inform people to decide. The negative is Australia's political knowledge and Germany more engagement voluntary votes. But comparing to countries with very different education system and a political culture isn't clean test of cause and effect. More importantly, in a voluntary system, the people who stay home are random sample. They are dispersed, poor, young, and marginalized. Their option isn't naturally noise. It's a systematic erasure of specific voice. A handful of uninformed votes spread across a position is a far smaller disaster than entire communities being missing from the count. Unforced voting has the real problems. The negative is right the mandatory voting of one fixed money in a politic or privileged rules. We already not success the average. But an argument for we but not rigidly ours removing Britain as voting right act did and recurrent turnout are complementary fix to the same problem that some voice counts less the others, adopting only the negative form and searching our lives the participation gap untouched. On enforcing voting doesn't reduce discussion. The negative notes Australia still has a heated debate, and the participants now spend more not less chasing turnout. True, mandatory voting was never meant to exercise disagreement, only to change how champions are won. Participants can no longer win by mobilizing just their against base. They must also pursue the millions who are girded to show up, recruited, deceived, from scientists turn out a persistent to vote persistent is effective to moderate and affect spending.
Alright, good afternoon, honorable judges, respected opponents, and members of the House. My first speaker has already explained why mandatory voting is harmful. He showed that it takes away freedom for just uniform people to vote and does not solve the real problems in democracy. Now, I would like to respond to the proposition's argument and strengthen our case. First, the proposition says mandatory voting creates better representation because everyone votes. We disagree. Because everyone casts a ballot does not mean everyone is represented. Some people do not vote because they do not trust any candidate. Others feel that none of the candidates represent their interest. If these people are forced to vote, many will simply choose a random candidate or submit a blank ballot. That is not real representation, it is only forced participation. Second, the proposition says mandatory voting creates a more engaged society. Again, we disagree. People do not become interested in politics because the law tells them to vote. Real engagement comes from interest and understanding, not from fear of a fine. Many people will simply vote because they have to. They may not know the issues, the candidates, or the policies. Therefore, forcing people to vote does not automatically create informed citizens. If we want citizens to be more informed, we should improve education and political awareness instead of forcing participation. Third, the proposition claimed that mandatory voting reduces political division and extremism. However, political division is caused by many factors such as social conflict, economic problems, and misinformation. Simply making more people vote does not solve this issue. Countries with compulsory voting still experience political conflict and public disagreement. Therefore, mandatory voting is not the solution the proposition claims it is. Yes, please.
If citizens are already required to obey laws, pay taxes, and serve society in many ways, why is requiring them to vote once every few years suddenly an unacceptable limit on freedom?
Alright, thank you for the question. So, paying tax and following laws affects everyone in society, but voting is a personal choice. In democracy, people should have the right to vote or not vote. Mandatory voting takes away that freedom and turns a right into a duty. Alright, I will continue my argument. So democracy is about freedom, not force. A healthy democracy allows people to make their own choices. There includes the choice to vote and the choice to not vote. In conclusion, sometimes not voting is a message. People should have the freedom to choose without being punished. Mandatory voting does not guarantee better representation or genuine political engagement. Most importantly, it limits democratic freedom. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Honorable Education, respect opponent, and members at the House. As the third speaker of the affirmative team, I will focus on the main class in today's debate and explain why the opposition has failed to defeat our needs. The opposition has spent most of this debate talking about freedom. They argue that citizens should have the right not to vote. However, they never explain why that freedom is more important than fair representation. Our first speaker showed that in voluntary voting system, politicians naturally focus on groups that vote consistently and pay less attention to groups that do not. The opposition never really answered this argument. Instead, they simply said people should be free to stay home. But if people stay home, why would politicians listen to them? This is the question of the opposition never answered. Democracy is not only about freedom,
It is also about representation. Government decisions affect everyone, including people who choose not to vote. If everyone is affected, then everyone deserves to be counted. The opposition also claims that not voting is a form of protest. But under our policy, people can still protest. They can submit a blank ballot or spoil their vote. In fact, that protests become much more visible. A politician cannot tell why someone stay home, but a spoiled ballot is officially recorded and sends clear message that voters are unhappy with their choice available. The second major argument from the opposition is about uninformed voters. They repeatedly say that mandatory voting will force uninformed people to participate. However, this argument depends on a very big assumption, that people who vote voluntarily are informed, while people who do not vote are uninformed. They never prove this. There are many people who vote despite having very little political knowledge. There are also many people who do not vote because they feel ignored, busy, or disconnected from politics. More importantly, democracy has never required citizens to pass a political knowledge test before having a voice. The issue in this debate is not whether every voter is perfectly informed. The issue is whether every citizen deserves representation. Finally, the opposition argued that mandatory voting does not solve deeper problems such as corruption, distrust, or money and politics. We agree that this problem exists, but during this debate, we never claimed that mandatory voting would solve every problem in democracy. What we claim is that it helps solve unequal political participation. The opposition acknowledged that turnout is unequal. They acknowledge that some groups are ignored. They acknowledge that politicians focus on reliable voters. Yet they offer no solution to this problem. Simply pointing out that other problems exist does not make our solution wrong. Member of the House, when we compare both sides, the difference is very clear. The opposition protects the freedom not to vote. We protect the right of every citizen to be represented. The opposition asks us to keep a system where some voices are consistently louder than others. We offer a system where politicians must pay attention to everyone because everyone participates. At the end of this debate, the opposition has shown that mandatory voting is not perfect, but they have never shown that voluntary voting is better. For this reason, we firmly stand in support of this motion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, honorable educator, respected opponent, and member of the House. As the third speaker of the negative team, I will focus on the major classes in this debate and explain why the proposition has failed to justify a mandatory voting. First, on representation. Throughout this debate, the proposition argued that mandatory voting creates better representation because everyone participates. However, they failed to answer our key point. Participation is not the same as representation. Many citizens do not vote because they feel that no candidate represents them or because they have lost trust in the political system. Forcing these people to cast a ballot does not solve their concern. It simply increases turnout statistics. A democracy should focus on earning people's trust, not forcing their participation. Second, on freedom. The proposition repeatedly compares voting to paying taxes and obeying laws. But voting is fundamentally different. Voting is a political right and democracy protects the freedom to use that right or not. The proposition never explained why citizens should be punished for choosing not to participate. If democracy is about respecting individual choice, then the choice not to vote must also be respected. A right becomes less meaningful when it is turned into a legal obligation. Third, on informed voters, the proposition claims that mandatory voting will create a more engaged and educated society, we disagree. Our team has already shown that education creates informed voters, not legal penalties. People who are uninterested in politics will not automatically become informed simply because they are required to vote. Many may randomly choose familiar names or submit blank ballots. This increases participation, but it does not improve the quality of democracy decision making. Member of the House, when we compare both sides, the difference is very clear. The proposition focuses on increasing turnout member. We focus on protecting freedom and ensuring that political participation is genuine. The proposition has shown that mandatory voting may increase the number of people at the polls, but they have not proven that it creates better representation, more informed voters, or a stronger democracy. In contrast, our side has demonstrated that mandatory voting limits freedom of choice, encourages meaningless participation, and fails to address the real reason why people choose not to vote. For this reason, we firmly oppose this motion and ask you